Am I still on your screen there? All right. So yes, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Ryan Owen. I'm a Farm Bill biologist with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever here in Indiana. Today I'll be talking about grassland management in general with a focus on prescribed fire. To get started, I would like to say thank you to Eddie and the rest of the Southwest Conservation Club for hosting this event today. It's very nice to be able to be out and demonstrate these types of techniques to landowners and really anybody who's interested in habitat management. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm a Farm Bill wildlife biologist. That's a partnership position between my organization, Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, as well as the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. There are currently 4 Farm Bill biologists in the state. We each work out of an NRCS office. Again, that's a Natural Resources Conservation Service. And essentially, we kind of work in partnership with the DNR as private lands biologists to try to help promote wildlife habitat, USDA habitat programs to landowners, and really, again, anybody interested in improving habitat or establishing habitat on their property. This is really driving me crazy. Okay, so quick poll here of the folks in attendance, who has a grassland or pollinator planting, CRP planting on their property? Show of hands. Got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Of those, is anybody enrolled in the CRP Conservation Reserve Program? Very good. Any other USDA habitat programs that have been used to establish that habitat? All right, that makes it easy for me as we go. So to begin, why do we need to manage these grassland habitats? There's really kind of 3 primary reasons, in my opinion. The first one being to control succession. So if we look at the picture here, we've got kind of a grassland type area surrounded by forest, and if you pay attention there on the left, that forest is really starting to encroach into this grassland habitat. The second would be to control invasive species or other unwanted species in general. If you see the picture here, we've got a grassland habitat with some common teasel. All of those little seed heads you see poking up at the background are invasive species that, if left uncontrolled, can really hinder the value of your wildlife planting. And finally, you would want to manage these sometimes just to increase the diversity in the stand. So you can see a picture here of a pretty diverse prairie planting. By having more diversity, you're going to increase the amount of food availability for wildlife. You're going to improve the cover that's available for wildlife. And in general, just. So let's dive into those a little bit more. What are we talking about when we're saying control succession? If you're not familiar, Indiana historically would have been mostly forested. So if you see where we are here in Fort Wayne, pre-settlement times would have been historically probably a beech maple forest. There are some, historic prairie type areas, but generally those are going to be on the western part of the state. So if we're not doing something to manage these grassland habitats, eventually they're going to continue to succeed and get further along into a forested type habitat. So if you think of like a field, a crop production field that you stop planting, that first year you're going to get a lot of annual weeds that come in. So things like foxtail, ragweed, lamb's quarter. By years 2 and 3, you're going to see more and more perennial plants moving into that habitat. By years 5, 6, 7, you start to see a lot of brush, brambles, even small woody trees will start to move in, especially species that are windblown. So maples, elms, sycamores, cottonwoods, a lot of these species then will start to move in. And if if you don't do something to keep those controlled or set back, eventually you're going to end up with a forest in that area. So in order to really effectively manage for that wildlife habitat, if you want to keep that grassland habitat component, you're going to have to do something to keep it set back. There are several species that are grassland dependent. So, ringneck pheasants, northern bobwhites, our grassland songbirds, a whole host of beneficial insects and native pollinators all depend on those grassland type habitats, as well as a whole host of other wildlife native to Indiana, not necessarily dependent on it, but will utilize these habitat types. So again, by managing that succession and keeping it into a grassland habitat, you're promoting more diversity on the landscape and better overall wildlife habitat. So number 2, controlling invasive or undesirable species. If we see the picture here, does anybody can see at this point? Anybody real good with noxious weeds or invasive species? Do we know what the picture is here? Yeah. Correct, in the back, yes, Canada thistle, thank you. So if you've ever had any sort of habitat, you've likely seen this either in your grassland planting or just popping up in roadsides. Very aggressive, non-native species that over time can create a monoculture, a single species planting essentially, which then will decrease the food availability for wildlife and a lot of times can decrease the mobility of the wildlife in that stand. So some other examples of potentially invasive or undesirable warm season grasses and cool season grasses used when we're talking about these grassland plantings. And ideally what we have is a planting that consists of native warm season grasses, which tend to have kind of a bunch form. So ideally you've got kind of a bunch of grass here, a bunch of grass here with wildflowers or open space interspersed in between those bunches that allows wildlife, especially say, game bird chicks, to move effectively amongst those bunches of grass. A lot of times we see non-native cool season grasses that tend to be more sod forming or turf type grasses come in and they'll fill in those open networks that we're really trying to promote. So things like tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome, reed canary grass, all of these species will often be something you'd want to control in these type of grassland plantings. And we also have our invasive woody species. So Eddie mentioned the honeysuckle that they've been battling here on the property. Honeysuckle, autumn olive, and Callery pear is starting to become one of our worst invaders. Is anybody aware of Callery pear just offhand? Okay, so if you're not familiar with it, Callery pear is the wild type of a very popular landscape tree, Bradford pears or Cleveland Select. There's quite a few different named varieties that are all essentially selections of that Callery pear. Because we've got so many of these varieties, we're starting to see those trees interbreed and really becoming a large headache on the landscape. So if you see the picture down there, that's one of the either Bradford or Cleveland Select. But what happens over time is birds spread those. And right now, if you drive around, you'll see a lot of fields full of this stuff. So it's really beginning to start to choke out our native grassland habitats. And many, many more. So the more you delve into these invasive species, the more you're going to find. Is anybody here looking at planting a new planting on their property? Okay. If you ever do consider it or working with anybody who is considering it, I can't stress enough how important proper site prep is. You can alleviate a lot of these concerns with invasive species by controlling them in the beginning before putting any seed out on the ground. So yes, the more site prep you can do and the better site prep you can do, the better off your habitat will be in the long run. Uh-oh. Might need your help. All right. Oh, there we go. All right, and lastly, increasing diversity. So if we see the picture here, we've got a lot of times where these grasslands were planted at very high rates of the native warm season grasses to begin with. And what that ends up doing is kind of choking out the forbs or wildflowers that would have been planted as well. So over time, you get this very dense stand of essentially warm season grasses, kind of a monoculture again. That leads to very poor cover, especially in the winter time. So this here picture was taken sometime in the winter, and you can see how that grass is really just laying flat. So you really don't get nearly the cover value that you would have if it was a diverse stand where you had more wildflowers or forbs in the mix. You also have a reduction of food there because a lot of times those wildflowers are providing a food source in the form of insects that they support and the seeds that they'll put off, as well as browse for, say, deer or other species like rabbits that might, feed on the actual plants themselves. So there's a lot of different options when it comes to managing habitat. Here's kind of what we're going to cover today. Again, we'll be focusing on prescribed fire, but we'll also talk briefly on herbicide treatments, disking, interseeding, grazing, mowing, and we won't really get into combinations a whole lot, but just keep in mind that all of these things can often work together to try to achieve whatever issue you might be having out there on your particular site. So to begin, the reason we're here today at a prescribed fire workshop is to promote prescribed burning if we can. Essentially what that is using fire to burn off the existing vegetation with a certain objective in mind and in a controlled manner. So we don't want people just hearing our message and going out and willy-nilly lighting stuff on fire. You really do want to have a purpose in mind and do it in a controlled fashion. Jessica will get into how to control that burn later on in her talk, but keep in mind that's the objective here. So what are some pros and cons of prescribed burning? Number one, this is very efficient. So it usually requires a handful of people. If you have friends who like to light stuff on fire, bring them along for the day. Make sure you've got proper equipment, proper fire lines installed. But oftentimes on small acreage like this, you can have that whole area burned off and set back that succession in really a matter of hours if properly prepared. It's going to remove thatch. So a lot of times you'll see thatch building up in these areas, which again can just limit mobility, especially if you're talking about say northern bobwhite, which when they're hatched out are just tiny little creatures that really need to be able to scurry pretty quickly to evade predators. If you've got a lot of thatch build up there, it makes it very difficult for those tiny chicks to move through that grassland. So you can kind of envision that thatch acting like a giant briar patch to you and I. So if you were trying to evade they're moving through a head. Also is going to recycle nutrients. So all of that ash is going to come back into the soils, generate much better growth that following year. It's going to help set back woody species, encourage your grasses and other fire adapted forbs that are in there. On the con side of things, we do have obviously the potential for escape. With that becomes potential for injury, property damage, even potential death. You can potentially result in favoring or encouraging the growth of some unwanted species. So something like Sericea lespedeza, even Canada thistle can be encouraged by that growth. keep in mind that while that could be a good or a bad thing, you can use that to encourage it and then come back later and treat it with an herbicide or something else. But just keep in mind, a lot of times fire on its own may not control the problem species you're after. And depending on the timing, if your issue is one of those dense ranked stands of grass, it might not effectively set that grass back the way you want. With that, timing of these burns is kind of everything, right? So depending on the time of year you're burning can really make a difference in the outcome and whether it fulfills your objective or not. So if you're burning in the spring, kind of the time of year we're at right now, you'll tend to encourage the warm season grasses in the stand, and at the same time kind of discourage or set back any wildflowers. So if you go out here, and we'll see this here in a little while, you'll notice that the warm season grasses, because they don't start typically growing until our soils get in the mid 50 to 60 degree range, a lot of your forbs have already been growing out there. So if we run a fire through there now, you're going to be burning off the tiny leaves of those wildflowers, but all you're doing is removing last year's dead vegetation on the warm season grasses. With that then becomes this whole black area, which does absorb heat a lot faster. So then it allows the soil to warm up, which then encourages your warm season grasses to grow, giving them a head start on those forbs or your wildflowers that have just been kind of set back and have to start to regrow the leaves you just burned off. So constant spring burning will tend to get you to that ranker stand of warm season grasses. It is great for site preparation. So if you're going to be taking a field of cool season grasses, like an old pasture, burning it off in the spring can give you a great start to do some herbicide treatments or something along those lines to help you get that stand ready. In the late summer period. Normally, we don't really encourage burning between spring and the end of summer to stay out of the primary nesting period. That's when a lot of our songbirds, game birds are using these areas for nesting. So we try to avoid any major disruption during those periods so that that wildlife can have a chance to reproduce and carry on. So if we're burning in late summer, though, that will get us tend to discourage our warm season grasses. So you're generally burning when those grasses are still green and growing. It seems like it's kind of impossible to burn a lot of times. You'll see stands that are very green and think, oh, there's no way we could get a fire to carry through there. But because of the fine leaf blade on these plants, you'd be surprised at how easily a fire can carry through there. Plus, a lot of times you've got a layer of thatch on the bottom there that's carrying that fire as well. If conditions are right and it's dry enough, you can get pretty effective control of woody species during this time, because that's when they're trying to put energy down into the root system. So if you can come through and burn them and cut off that supply of energy going down, you'll be a little bit more effective at controlling those trees than if you were to do a spring burn trying to control trees. You'll often see this not result in that complete burn like we would see in the springtime. So you'll see, more standing vegetation that can be used as cover throughout the winter and be, a valuable resource for your wildlife in the area during that time. Thank you, Joel. Lastly, we've got kind of fall or winter birds. So when you're in kind of this dormant time frame, most of your plants have gone dormant. They're not actively growing at this point in the year. These burns will tend to encourage the forb component, the wildflowers out in your stand. Again, we're getting, because it's dead vegetation most of the times, a more complete burn again. And this can be a really valuable opportunity to prepare your site for future follow-up. So if you've got a lot of cool season grasses in the stand or Canada thistle, burning at this time of the year can remove that vegetation, so it's easier to come back and do a follow-up spray or to see those problem species, you know, if there's, say, a rosette out there. So it can be a good preparation for future management. Moving into herbicide treatments. So we're going to kind of go a little faster through some of this. But you can use herbicides to do this same sort of management a lot of times. If, you know, we go through today and you think, well, you know, burning's still not quite for me, but I'd like to do something to maintain my habitat. These next few options are going to be, you know, okay to use. Again, they're not going to be quite as effective or efficient as prescribed fire, but it might be something you could use, you know, either in conjunction or in place to get similar results. So you're generally going to be using herbicides to set back or manage existing vegetation. So it's great for controlling some of those thicker, ranker stands of grasses. The big thing here is, you know, depending on the plant you're trying to control, the timing of your spray is going to be critical. There's several different application types, and we'll touch on a few of those here next. But first and foremost, I mean, it's critical that whatever chemical you're using is that you follow the label and make sure that you're using that product at a recommended rate and for the labeled application type. So again, some pros and cons here of herbicide treatments. Pros would be it's very effective at controlling trees or that non-native cool season grass. Great, again, for setting back rank stands if you want to set your warm season grasses back and open up that space. Can be hired out fairly easily. So a lot of times you can reach out to an ag co-op or a neighboring farmer. Somebody might have this spray equipment a little more readily than what they might have burn equipment to use. And this is going to be your best option. It can be used in combination with it, but fire in and of itself often won't be enough to set back or really effectively control a lot of our problem invasives. Some of the cons is that if you're not real experienced, you will need to calibrate your equipment. So again, making sure that you're putting this product out there at the recommended rates is critical. So you do need to make sure your equipment's calibrated correctly, and it's not going to do anything to remove that thatch that we talked about. So you're still going to be left with that as an issue if that's a concern for your management program. Thank you. So again, we've got a few different types of application types. You'll often hear the term strip spraying, which is essentially, if you can see the diagram on here, a strip spraying is where you're going to be taking a 30 or 50-foot wide swath, spraying that whole swath 1 year, and then skipping double that. So you would, if you sprayed a 30-foot wide path, you would skip 60 foot, spray another 30 foot, skip 60 foot, spray another 30 foot. And then the next years after, you would come back and do that same pattern, but hit the strips that you skipped the first year. This can be very valuable in creating good habitat adjacent to denser habitat, which can be valuable for, say, winter cover. The next type would be kind of a block spraying. Normally, you're going to do this block spraying in kind of a combination with prescribed fire. So where you'd be burning off the entire block or burn unit that you're working on. Then you could come back and spray that entire block if, say, cool season grass is an issue, or your grasses are so rank that you want to set those back. So here we're looking at kind of this bigger block pattern here. And then lastly, we've got spot spray. So essentially taking a backpack sprayer, or a lot of times folks will use UTV mounted sprayers with a little hand wand where you're literally going around trying to find those small patches of invasive species a lot of times, spraying those rather than treating a whole large area. This does require vigilance. So if you've got one of these plantings, it really does require early and often monitoring of that stand just to make sure you can stay on top of these problems before they get out of control. Generally, you're using kind of more selective herbicides here, where you're targeting, not only that specific plant, but targeting that group of plants with that herbicide. And I would include kind of stump treatments. So if you're cutting woody vegetation, like Eddie had mentioned again on this honeysuckle, you might cut that off and then treat the stump there with an herbicide so that it doesn't regrow on you. Next, we're going to get into disking. As the picture shows here, and you may be aware, essentially we're just looking at disrupting the soil here with a piece of equipment with the goal of opening up that stand and creating some bare soil there. The pros here, again, it's going to be fairly effective at controlling small woody trees. It's great for setting back those thick stands of grass. It's going to tend to promote your wildlife-friendly annual plants like common ragweed or foxtail, and it's a great way to make fire breaks. So if you're looking at burning something and you don't have an effective break between units or adjacent vegetation, you can disc that area, get it back to bare soil so that you don't have that fire creeping across there and catching something on fire that you don't want. There's a pretty good list of cons here, so you do want to be kind of careful with this just because it can tend to drag up weed seeds. So if you've got a bunch of Canada thistle you've been battling, likely you're going to flush more of that out of the soil each time you disturb the soil with this disking. You're also going to be creating potential for erosion. So if you've got a lot of roll to your land, you really want to be careful on how you disc it. You want to disc on the contours so that you're not creating large gullies out there. It's also not going to be real effective at controlling the non-native cool season grasses long-term. So it might set those back and cut up the roots, but you're still going to have that stuff persisting over time. And kind of lastly, if you're concerned with your pollinators on the landscape, this will tend to damage some of those ground nesting bee nests. So if you think of like bumblebees, for example, a lot of times they're nesting, just below the surface. So if you're running a disc over them, you're likely going to be disturbing those nests. Interseeding is another one that we hear a lot about, especially with farm bill programs. It often sounds like a great idea, but in my opinion is kind of overused. So what this is, though, is adding more wildflower or legume or forb seed into your existing stand. Some pros here is it can increase the diversity of your stand. So you can get more plants out on the landscape this way. Some of the cons, though, is it does require typically quite a bit of site preparation. So if you think of, again, some of these really thick stands of warm season grasses, if you were just to go out there and scatter seed, the likelihood of that seed getting to the soil to begin with is not very good. And then the grasses are already so well established, they're going to outcompete anything that does get to the soil and germinate. So usually you're going to have to do quite a bit of work prior before this interseeding is effective. And that seed can be expensive. So it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to, buy an expensive mix and go out there and spread it willy-nilly for it to do nothing or do very little for you. Again, you're going to have to do something to set that stand back, open up space. This can be accomplished through either broadcasting or no-till drilling. Generally, it's best if that's done during the dormant season. A lot of our native perennial plants will require a period of cold, moist treatment before they will germinate. So if you can get those seeds out on the landscape in kind of a December, January, February timeframe, they'll get that cold, moist treatment, and that will encourage better germination that first year. With any planting, you do want to be careful you're not planting it too deep. A lot of these wildflower seeds are extremely tiny, so if you get them too deep, you're just not going to see them germinate. And again, just kind of a waste of money and effort. It can be very valuable if you're targeting certain species. And I often look at our native pollinators as one great use of these interseedings. Not often necessary for general wildlife because, again, you can get some really great benefits just by burning or disking where you're encouraging those wildlife-friendly annuals to come back into your stand. But if your primary species of focus or secondary species of focus is, pollinating insects like our monarch butterfly, you can have really great success if done properly. And it's great for aesthetics. I think a lot of times people would value the wildflower portion in these. Once we get into prime bloom period here in midsummer, it makes the stands look a lot prettier, and therefore, makes folks want to plant more of these. So by having a more diverse stand, you will generally be helping out wildlife in general, because more folks will hopefully want to plant them to get that same beauty on their property. Grazing, I'm not going to claim to be any sort of a real grazing expert here, but they can be very useful in managing grassland habitats. So there again, we're essentially utilizing livestock to keep this grassland habitat in check. Some of the pros is that it can help grasses from dominating. That's going to help improve diversity. It will give you a nice forage resource in the summertime. So a lot of times pastures have been planted to these cool season grasses, which will tend to shut down in that mid-summer range, right as these warm season grasses are really boosting up. So if you are a grazer or know someone who is, encourage them to include some warm season grasses in their rotation. Can be, not only good for their production, but can be great for wildlife habitat as well. It does kind of require a more careful management. You don't want to leave the animals out on the grassland so long that they chew it down and kind of ruin that cover. And then if you have a lot of animals out there, you run the risk of erosion. So there again, just a little bit more careful management, but it can be used very successfully, like I said, on the landscape to help not only wildlife, but to encourage a good source of forage in that kind of summer slump period when a lot of our cool season grasses tend to shut down. Lastly, here we've got mowing. I put mowing at the end just because a lot of times mowing has been overused in the past. So mowing, as I'm sure you're aware, is the mechanical removal of cutting of that vegetation. Not always the greatest thing, because people tend to rely too much on that mowing. You're going to tend to do more damage the more you mow to these types of plantings. They really are meant to be taller stands of habitat to provide cover for wildlife. It is good for kind of keeping trees in check. I guess I would tend to promote mowing if you're using it as a site preparation method or in conjunction with another one of the previously mentioned efforts. So you might mow in preparation for spraying so that you're not wasting your herbicide on old dead vegetation. But it does create a lot of thatch. You're just laying all of that material down, so it's definitely not going to do anything for your thatch issue. Won't tend to thin grasses very much if your problem is those thick stands of grasses. It's going to tend to promote that non-native cool season grasses. So if you think, like mowing your yard, that encourages more yard. The same thing happens out in your warm season grass stands. And it tends to, again, because of that, it's going to reduce the diversity of your stand overall. So a lot of times when we're looking at these habitat management practices, folks get concerned that by doing any sort of management, it's going to be bad for wildlife because you're removing the cover that they rely on. And that's true to a point. So timing and the amount of disturbance you do at any one given time is going to be key. If we look again back to our pattern here we showed earlier, you ideally want to do disturbance on no more than at least half, and ideally no more than a third at any one given time, so that you're leaving refuge for the wildlife there to use, or beneficial insects, pollinators, etc. Again, trying to avoid that nesting season. So staying out of those fields or doing minimal maintenance during, the period generally from April through mid-August is ideal. And again, just not disturbing the whole area at one given time. especially if it's a large acreage where you've got a lot of wildlife inhabiting that area. As we get towards the end here, I just want to give a note. You know, a lot of times people get so caught up in what they're managing for. So, you know, I come from a pheasant and quail organization where people, you know, that might be their primary focus, where I just want more quail out on the landscape. You really do want to give consideration to some of the off-target species that you might not be managing for, but are still utilizing these habitats. So one of those, oh man, do you see that guy flutter? Anybody see that? Oh. So pollinators, you know, again, we mentioned bumblebees earlier. Very important, you know, they're, I don't even remember now, we're somewhere in the 450 species of bees native to Indiana. Without them, we certainly would not have, you know, as successful crop pollination as we do. So trying to make sure that you're not removing vegetation that they're reliant on is important. Bats, very effective insect control. We have some endangered species here in the state. So even though they might not be using those grasslands real heavily, if you're putting heavy smoke into a woodland habitat they might be using or roosting in, that can be detrimental to them. Salamanders will often be found out in these things. Jessica likes Massasaugas. So yes, snakes, whether you hate them or love them, are very valuable to our ecological processes. Turtles, you'll often find, you know, box turtles roaming through grassland habitats. So, you know, again, just try to give consideration when you are managing, whether you're burning, disking, spraying, whatever you might be doing. Try to do it outside of those periods when wildlife are heavily using those areas. And often that's kind of the dormant season would be preferred. So if you do have this type of habitat, you know, what might be the best grassland management for you? Well, it really depends. You know, are you in a government program that has requirements associated with it? What species of insects or wildlife or plants are you trying to promote? What issues are you having? What equipment do you have or have access to? You know, if you're looking at burning, do you have 6 friends that want to come over and light stuff on fire with you? Do you have budget constraints? You know, do you, you know, are you on a shoestring budget, or, you know, is it kind of sky's the limit sort of thing? And then, you know, what might work for you isn't necessarily going to work for your neighbor, and what your problem is might not be the same problem your neighbor's having. Oftentimes, you know, your neighbor might have a better looking stand than you, where, you know, running the fire through it periodically is all that's needed to maintain it and keep it looking good. Whereas you might be overrun with bush honeysuckle and autumn olive with cool season grasses underneath. So you might just need more work. You know, it might be a combination of spraying and mowing and burning to really get the habitat looking as good as it can. It's a lot of information here. So if this is all way too much, there's resources available for you, whether that's, you know, myself, other farm bill biologists, soil and water conservation staff, Indiana Department of Agriculture staff. There's a whole host of folks out there that are willing to help you out. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you ever have questions or just need more information on your property in general. And if you're thinking about creating a new stand on your property, I can't stress it enough just how important proper planning and site preparation truly is. Again, you can alleviate a lot of these problems just by, you know, paying attention to proper site prep in the first place. There's a lot of things you can do to help yourself out in the long run. So if you've got a woods adjacent or a wet area, that might be something that's better suited for a tree planting, or to let it vegetate naturally rather than trying to force a grassland planting into those areas that want to be trees faster. One thing, again, we're trying to get away from as we're developing seed mixes is just not planting too much grass to begin with. Really trying to focus more on the wildflower or forb portion of that mix, because you really do get a lot of fantastic benefits out of that forb or wildflower component. And then lastly, just, don't be afraid to try something different. If you've been burning in the spring every year, whether that's on rotation or not, try to think about doing, maybe a late summer burn or a fall burn. Again, the more you can kind of diversify your operation and your management objectives and strategies, the more diversity you're going to build into that habitat and habitat on a larger landscape scale. Yes, question.
So I have a question about percentages when we left out between forests and grasses.
Yes.
In this planting area, so you're saying less grass, more forest. So would it be like 20% grass, 80% forest? Where do you want to do the recommendation?
Yes. So for anybody that's listening online here, she was asking if we've got kind of a recommendation on the percentages and a mix between grasses and the forbs or wildflowers. So yes, I generally try to keep grasses below 50% in mixes, typically shooting for somewhere in the 40 to 50% range. And anymore, we really look at these mixes on a number of seeds on average in any given square foot. So that's typically what we're basing that proportion off of. Not to get too nerdy on that, but it really makes a big difference if you're looking at the number of seeds per square foot, because you might have some seeds that are very large and some seeds that are very small. So if you're looking at it as a proportion of weight or some other measure, you're not really comparing apples to apples. So if you can look at it on that seeds per square foot basis, you really get much more even comparison. And yes, I generally shoot for that 40 to 50% grass in my mixes. So again, the picture we've got here was taken by one of our chapter members. And this was a burn. He burned in early September, and the picture was taken in mid-October. So if you see, you can first see there's a lot of little stems still standing here. So that's what I refer to when I say it wasn't a complete burn. There was still some standing vegetation there that can be used as some cover. And you're also getting some regrowth here. So, a lot of these plants, especially again, that forb component or the wildflowers, can be used as browse throughout the wintertime. So if you're conducting this fire early enough in the late summer or early fall period, you're going to get kind of a flush of plants that are regrowing and then can provide potential food source throughout the winter. Do we have any other questions? Jessica.
You talked about using mowing and irrigation. So for some of these folks that they only have mow as an option in the urban area or part of the
Yes, so tips or tricks for mowing in maybe an urban setting where fire might not be an option. Ideally, if you can get access to a flail mower, that will tend to chop up the vegetation a little finer rather than a rotary mower that's going to lay down swaths of thick vegetation evenly, so you don't have that kind of thatch or smothering issue you might have with a rotary mower. Timing of that mowing is going to be pretty critical. So again, making sure you're not mowing during the nesting period where you're not going to be chopping up baby birds or rabbits or deer. It happens, Jessica. So generally dormant period mowing is preferred. That's kind of my tips and tricks there. And again, always making sure you're trying to leave some refuge there. So only mowing a portion of it anytime you are going to be mowing. Yes, Ben.
On your guys, when the recommendations with your follow-up burns, later season burns, optimal early spring. On these follow-up seasons, you mentioned utilizing it as a follow-up if you're seeing stuff like this one kind of popping up. Is that within the same calendar year? Like if we burned in March, we're burning again in September and October, or next year doing it later than that.
Right. So I guess when I'm saying utilizing burning in conjunction with maybe another control method to help with controlling that invasive species. So if you burned in, say, March to help control Canada thistle, expect a Canada thistle explosion, and then go out within that summer and make sure you're treating with an effective herbicide to control that vegetation. And then just keeping on top of that, with sound management afterwards. Yes. Okay, so she was asking if there's a certain time period where you shouldn't spray because of kind of volatility issues. Is that, yes, definitely, but that's going to be wholly dependent on the type of herbicide you're using. Some are going to be much more volatile and likely to then drift off site and cause damage to either your own property or adjacent properties. So that's where, again, coming back to making sure that whatever you're doing, whatever herbicide you're using, you're following those directions on the label. So it will always give you, volatility risk and temperature ranges that you should or should not be spraying within. So yes, always making sure that you're following the label.
Sorry.
You got one? Well, now you got to come up with one. Your hand was kind of raised. Now you've got to think of something. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I'm not familiar with either one of your organization, the Pheasants Forever, the Bill Forever, .org. So then I told you they're nonprofit. Does that mean you only work with nonprofits within your organization, or can you work with like communities and companies?
Sure. So the question was more on what Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever is and who we can or cannot work with. So yes, we are a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. We work on a chapter basis. So we have chapters across the country. We have a fairly unique model in that our chapters raise money and then they get to decide where the money they raise goes. So we have chapters in, I think we're somewhere around the 20 chapters across Indiana, couple right here in the state. In fact, we have one of them has supported the event here today by providing some snacks and beverages. So I'd like to give a thank you to the Eel River chapter for support. But no, we can work with anybody, and oftentimes we do partner with a lot of other organizations to promote wildlife habitat, whether that's other not-for-profits, government organizations, communities a lot of times, and certainly private landowners. So because our model is, dependent on those local grassroots volunteers, they get to decide how the money they raise goes. So if you have projects or are looking to partner, I would always encourage you to reach out to those local chapters. And if need be, reach out to me and I can get you in touch with those folks in your area. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you for your time, and thanks again, Eddie and the Southwest Conservation Club for hosting this today.
All right. So thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. It's really good to talk to people about prescribed fire and other habitat management practices. Thank you to the Southwest Conservation Club for hosting us, some of the members coming out today. CD up here, if you don't know, they're actually helping all the virtual attendees as well, and they help set up all this equipment. And so big thank you to everyone involved, and obviously the Eel River chapter for donating food, because that's always a plus. So I guess with that, we'll get started real quick. Oh, I guess, how's he doing then? He's using them. Oh, that's okay. I got it. All right, so I'm going to real quickly talk to you about my position with the Division of Fish and Wildlife. So I am the North Region Urban Wildlife Biologist. So that means I cover Elkhart, Fort Wayne, and South Bend predominantly, and some of the smaller surrounding areas. Especially for habitat work and things like prescribed fire and workshops. I actually have all of Allen, St. Joe, and Elkhart County for living with wildlife questions. And then we also have a South Urban biologist, Erin. She takes care of pretty much the Indianapolis area. But that link down there, if you go to our website, we do have a list to all of our district biologists. Kent is another district biologist back in the corner there. He's here helping me show some stuff today. So being an urban biologist, I work under what we call the 4 urban wildlife pillars. So those are wildlife conflict mitigation, which is arguably a close number 2, if not one of the biggest things I spend a lot of my time on. We also do things like promoting green resources, green infrastructure, sustainability. That's its own pillar, but ultimately, as always, gets kind of filtered into the other 3 pillars. Where I spend most of my time is arguably trying to develop and improve and acquire urban wildlife habitat. So things like the Southwest Conservation Club, those prairie areas, those are things that I try to promote. And then finally, the 4th pillar that we have is promoting conservation appreciation for education and outreach, workshops, those types of things. So if you're going to ask what an urban biologist does, we do probably do some of the things that you would expect a biologist to do. We help with surveys for birds, deer sampling, goose banding, those types of things. So that's kind of what we do, but there's a lot of other components to it that you may not realize or maybe you've heard a little bit about, but don't know as much about. So one of the biggest things that I mentioned was living with wildlife. As the urban biologists knew this year, both urban biologists, we are responsible for all Canada goose removal permits in the state of Indiana. Each year, we also put on the workshop to talk to people about doing Canada goose work for hire throughout the state. We also work with our communications team to do things like living with wildlife fact sheets, so things like the coyote fact sheet, media interviews, those types of things. Again, promoting that green infrastructure and sustainability. So talking to local parks and local areas and local property owners about ways to improve their habitat or their property to be more green. Things like promoting prescribed fire for habitat management, those types of things. Developing and improving and acquiring habitat. A lot of times I'm talking with a lot of landowners, private landowners especially, because Indiana's land is 96 to 97% privately owned. So if we're going to work on conservation as a whole, we have to start working with private landowners. So I go out working management plans. As part of my programming, if you have a qualifying project, I do have cost share funding available to those for certain projects. And then finally, education outreach. So state fair, R3 events. We have done an R3 events here in the past when we did a learn to hunt squirrel workshop. So all those types of things. So today I'm going to talk about the little nitty-gritty, more details about the actual burning portion. So why we burn, fire behavior, those types of things. And there's probably going to be a little bit of overlap with what Ryan talked about earlier. Okay, there we go. So why do we burn? It sounds like Ryan pretty much covered most of this earlier, but it's really one of our most effective methods at managing plant communities. So we talked about removing that thick litter layer to promote new growth, to create movement for wildlife, stimulating the germination of our native native plants and wildlife, stimulating the germination of our native seeds. And then we also try, when we burn that thatch and those other vegetation, it releases those dead or organic things in those burns back into the ground, so the chemicals are there and available for new plants. And then again, as Ryan mentioned, to do site preparation for other treatments. Maybe. There we go. And as we've already seen this diagram once today, but essentially controlling natural succession. If you guys think about an empty lot that you've seen, what would happen if absolutely nothing was done to it? Eventually, over time, as Ryan talked about, you'd have first the annual grasses, then the perennials will move in, followed by the shrubs and some of the trees, and then eventually you'd become a mature forest again. So in order to keep up that early succession habitat, you have to disturb a prairie planting or something along those lines and remove that woody vegetation if you want to keep that component. So some differences that I want to highlight before we get too far into is prescribed fire is not wildfire. I'm pretty sure most of you here today already know that, but being in an urban area, which the Southwest Conservation Club is located within Fort Wayne city limits, these are some of the concerns that people will have if you're talking about doing prescribed fire on your own property, or if you're just having a conversation to try and educate people about the benefits of prescribed fire. So prescribed fire, it's set intentionally, and in the burning of a prescribed fire, you're taking into consideration the safety of both people and wildlife. Ryan talked about the burning dates. We've tried to avoid that all April to August window. Other things that you try and do, you go out and walk the property and try and see if there's any red flags that you need to be aware of before you light a fire, those types of things. Usually it's to either increase forbs or increase grasses or remove woody vegetation. So when you set a prescribed fire, you have an objective in mind. And then you also have controls in place. So you have your barrier, you have your trained personnel, you have your proper equipment, and you have your burn plan. Whereas a wildfire, it's set unintentionally usually or accidentally. And usually if it's really bad, it can threaten people's lives and their property and obviously do great harm. So that's the key component. A lot of people just assume all fire is bad, probably because of last year there was a lot of bad news surrounding a lot of unfortunate wildfires, which is not what we want to ever have happen. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about fire behavior. If you ever go to get fully trained to do fire training for wildland management and those types of things, you can get the training and you'll go into great detail about all of these different components of fire. But I'm just going to briefly cover some of them today. So things like the weather, the timing, what your surrounding areas look like, site conditions, the topography, what resources you have available to you to do your burn. These are all factors that come into what your fire is going to do and how it's going to behave. So the first behavior we want to talk about is wind. So the best thing we want when we're doing prescribed fire is we want to be able to predict what that fire is going to do and how to manage it, if it's going to, the direction it's traveling, if it gets out of hand, what we're going to do, those types of things. So fire is more predictable when you have steady wind speed and steady direction. And usually when we talk about wind speed, we are measuring it at 20 feet above ground level, which is where most of your local forecasts are going to get their wind speed measurements. NOAA is another good website if you don't have a favorite local station you want to listen to. Usually you're looking for at least 68 miles per hour for good smoke dispersal, and that's again at that 20-foot measurement height. But on the ground, you're looking for about 1 to 3 miles per hour. And you also have to take this with not just the wind, but you have to look at how that wind plays into what your site looks like. Now, are you in a big open area on the high altitude where any wind's just going to carry through, or are you maybe down in a bowl where the wind won't have as much of an effect? Those are all things you have to think about. Essentially, what you want to do is avoid those light and variable winds, because that's when you cannot as easily predict what your fire may or may not do. And I feel like I better just rip the Band-Aid off now. I was checking the weather conditions, and right now, based on our burn management plan, our wind speeds are outside of the allowable time for safety. So with that being said, we will still go out and walk and talk about the site. We will still demonstrate, and you will have the opportunity if you want to look and feel some of the burn equipment. And if you choose to, we do have some videos for backup where we will play the videos of different types of fire, and we can discuss what's happening through those as we watch them. So as I said, it's unfortunate, but it's more important to be safe than to be sorry. So the other thing that we want to talk about is relative humidity. Most of these things are fairly intuitive that I'm going to talk about, but if you're like me, it can be as intuitive as you would want it to be, but unless someone points it out to you, you never think about it. So obviously, as your humidity decreases, your fuels become drier. Now, when I talk about fuels, what does that mean? You can just yell it out. When I say fuels on a bird site,
Dry stuff.
Dead, dry stuff. So basically what the vegetation that you're burning is, that is your fuel for your fire. Also, as relative humidity goes up, stuff retains more moisture, and it's less likely to burn. A good rule of thumb, it's not a solid rule of thumb, but it's something that you can easily kind of think about if you're out on a burn site and need to think about it. For every 20 degrees increase in temperature, the relative humidity, it gets cut in half. It works both ways. So if you decrease 20 degrees, the RH doubles. It's a good rule of thumb to help you out if you need a quick kind of thought, or if it's changed from when you were able to look at a computer to the time you got to the site, those types of things. For most of our purposes, you're going to want your goal somewhere between 40 and 55% relative humidity. Actually, when we got here, we were out of prescription for relative humidity, but since then it's backed off to the window, but now our wind speed's picked up. So there's a lot of different factors you always have to look into. If you're at less than 30%, that's when your stuff is really dry, and that's when you can get those really high hot fires with high burning intensity, and those can become dangerous. If you're getting above the 55%, you're likely just not going to burn, going to be conducive to you. You're wasting your time to try and get it to burn. The other thing that we think about is temperature. That again, like I said, it's pretty intuitive, but that will influence your moisture content of your fuel. Obviously, the higher temperatures, there's going to be more solar radiation to dry out and really make that vegetation hot. For late winter to early spring, you really want that 20 to 60 degree window for temperature. Specifically to kill woody vegetation, you need your fire temperatures to be greater, or the temperatures need to be greater than 60 degrees outside, so that way it can actually get hot enough to really take away that woody vegetation. And then you also have to think about the time of day when you affect the temperature. It's obviously going to be really hot later in the afternoon, where if you did an earlier morning burn, those are things that you can look at. But then you have to think about, can you, for example, if you want to push it later in the afternoon, can you put that fire out before nightfall? Because you don't really want to have to fight a fire in the dark if something were to happen. If you're looking at this picture here, you can kind of see how different heights plants are going to be affected by the flame. Obviously, it's going to be hottest in that central area where most of that flame's going. If you get higher up in a tree where the seed is, maybe you're finding, maybe it's calorie paired and you want to try and get off some of that seed that's going to spread, you might not be damaging as much of that seed as you would think you were, whereas some of the stuff down further closer to the ground is going to burn. And then this is important because if you think about some of our invasive species, they're not just spreading by seed, but some of them are spreading through their rhizomes underground. So you have to think about, are you going to be able to get it hot enough to kill those rhizomes? Because you can maybe cut it all down all you want, but if those rhizomes are still there, it's still going to carry and spread and cause more of an invasion problem. Additionally, rainfall and soil moisture affect your fire. Again, pretty intuitive. You guys are all very damp soils protect those root zones from some of the stuff that maybe you damaged, but maybe if you're looking for canary grass that you want to control, maybe you do want it a little hotter to fry off some of those rhizomes. If you're looking to do more of a protection thing, you are looking for damp to moderately wet. You also are looking for that in order to be more safe in your burn. If you look at this picture here, this was actually a burn workshop we did in 2019. And what do you guys notice about the ground where he's trying to light a fire? Exactly. So this was just a demonstration area, but it was so wet out there that even the drip torch and the fuel on the ground from the drip torch was not lighting. So while for safety wise, there's not a high risk of spreading the fire, you're not likely going to be productive with your time trying to make that fire burn. This one, unfortunately, was also out of prescription, so we couldn't burn that day either. So don't feel like it's just you guys. The other thing that we want to talk about is topography. I understand that in Indiana, our topography, especially in the Northeast, is not exactly rolling hills everywhere, but you still have to think about your aspect, if you have a slope or a hill, how the terrain looks. So aspect is the direction of the slope. So if you have a north-facing slope, it's not going to get as much sun exposure as maybe a south-facing slope. So that might affect your temperature and how the sun's hitting that slope and affecting your fuel there. Slope is the degree of the incline, how steep is it? Think about if you're burning uphill, right? Because of how the flame goes up against the slope, that flame is going to carry faster going uphill, right? So you have to think about those things. Additionally, what may be something else that you have to worry about if you're burning uphill? If the fire is going away from you and you start burning things, what may happen if you're falling behind the fire? Burning trunks rolling down, exactly. And someone else back there made the motion. So yeah, you have to think, that's another thing. It's not just about how the fire will burn, you have to think about your safety. And then the terrain is the shape or the lay of the land. Again, and we'll talk about it later, it's really important to walk where you're going to burn ahead of time. It's really not going to be fun if you're out there doing a controlled or prescribed fire and there's a deep hole someone didn't know about and one of your people burning on your property steps in that hole into a single. That's not fun, it's not safe. So it's really important to really know your land that you're burning. You don't want any surprises. So in planning a burn, this is where I'm going to talk about a lot about your burn management plan that you should all have a copy of. There's 4 main components of this. There's a regulation review, the evaluation of your burn sites, how to prepare for the actual burn, and then right before you do what you're going to do to make sure you have everything ready and on site. It sounds redundant, but there's a reason for that. It's safety. So one of the first things that you're going to definitely need to do is you need to review your requirements of your state, local, county government, any ordinance that you may have against open burning. You can get information from the sheriff, you can call the fire department. Some people, some cities actually have the ordinances online that are pretty easily accessible. Other ordinances may be a little bit more difficult to find. Maybe your county health department and others. So this is specifically taken from Fort Wayne city ordinances, and they actually require not just a permit from, they require a permit from the fire departments in addition to any permits required by IDEM. So IDEM is the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and they're the ones that you will send an application in if you need to have a burn plan. So in the city of Fort Wayne, you'll need both of those pieces of paper to burn. And in the interest of today, we had both on our hand in case we needed to. And then for the ordinances, the IDEM permit is important because you will see in your burn plan that we have a list on page 3 of persons to be contacted, okay? And I listed some initial numbers there, but after digging in, these are my notes for the people I had to call and when. So after getting the permit, I had to not only call the fire department and the sheriff department, I also had to call the health department and Allen County Environmental Management in order to make sure I was compliant. Some people actually requested that I call before and after the burn. Some people only required to call 24 hours of notice. Some people said, you let me know, we're good to go, and you don't need to call me again unless something goes horribly wrong. So that's something to think about. You really need to make sure you know your local ordinances. So then for your burn site evaluation, this is the current site, and I walked it actually on the 1st. So I checked along the edge to make sure there was nothing of damage. Eddie and I talked about some of the signs that were out there, a bench that was out there, and again, we'll go out there and walk that in a bit and you can kind of see it. But we talked to make sure that we have a good fire break. If you haven't historically done a burn on your property, you really want to make sure you're looking to site prep maybe 6 months to a year in advance. It just depends on what you have availability to do. If you're going to have established fire breaks, maybe you have to start mowing. That one that I told you about where we weren't able to burn, he actually started mowing down the perimeter 6 months before we went out there to try and do the burn. It was all Siberian elm, so it wasn't a huge loss, but it's still a process and a lot of work that he had to do. We also have to make sure we're contacting the neighbors. The good rule of thumb is if they're 500 feet or closer, you need to make sure they're aware that you're about to burn. You need to make sure you look out there to see if you have equipment needs. Is it a small area where a couple of people with flappers and backpack sprayers is enough, or is it something that's a large enough area where you need to have a water tank mounted on an ATV to get to a section quickly? Those are the things you have to think about. And again, Ryan talked about this a lot. What type of fire is needed? What are we doing? Are we increasing forbs and flowers? Are we controlling woody invasion? And that's part of this management plan as well. We were trying to increase our warm season grass establishment and control woody vegetation. And I should mention, and we do get in this a little more detail later. So this is a prescribed management plan for fire that the Division of Fish and Wildlife, the district biologist and urban biologist can give to landowners. What we'll do is we'll get your information, talk with you, work with you on filling out this management plan. We actually have a separate fire complexity sheet. You actually won't get a copy of this, but we look at this, run the numbers to see if your fire is safe for us to even recommend it to you. And if it is, we can write the windows and timeframes of what you would need to burn. If you're getting a prescribed fire management plan from the DNR, everything that we recommend from the division is going to be back burning because it is the safest burn, and we're going to go into that later. But this just tells you kind of where this piece of paper comes into this. So I worked with Eddie. We got this management plan together for the Southwest Conservation Club. So again, we still need to make sure we're really evaluating our site. If you look at here, you can kind of see what kind of fuels we're going to have. We know it's thin, some of the forbs, some of the grasses. Sometimes you have to walk out there to see if there's woody vegetation growing up, those types of things. The amount and type of fuels in an area, again, topography and the location of the property boundaries. So using the site, we made a map of the area, we walked the site, we looked at the location of the roads and the trails, water bodies, we looked for natural fire breaks, we looked for smoke sensitive areas. I'm sure you guys all know the camper set out right next to the field when you pulled in. So he came last night unexpectedly, which is totally fine. But when I first got here, I saw that he had a bunch of little children running around. Children and elderly patients in hospitals, those are all people that are probably going to be much more sensitive to smoke. So I actually went and had a conversation about him about what he wanted to do if we were able to burn today. So these are all things that you have to always be thinking about. The pathway was new since the last time I visited when I came out on first. So I actually reached out to Eddie and I said, what happens if that burns? Is it even safe to be burnt? And he pointed out the split rail fencing where he didn't want to have burned. So these are all things that we had to think about and plan for today for burning. So I can't reiterate enough. It's really important to make sure you're checking your property up until the day before and the day of to make sure you're ready to go on the day of the burn. Another big thing that I don't think I have in here, but it was pretty heavily discussed when I went through the wildlands training, is you're not really supposed to be burning trash anyway. And then some people, especially maybe more in agricultural and rural areas, there can be the potential for dumping chemicals and barrels out in the field or off the side of the road. So it kind of goes back to your volatility question. It's really not good if you're burning and you've burned up a barrel of something that you shouldn't be burning. So those are all things to think about. Like I said, it's not likely to happen for this small of an area, but there are situations where that is a very serious concern. And it's really no fun when you get in trouble for burning trash. So pop quiz, and I feel free to shout out anything. What do you guys see in these pictures that are things for concern? You can just shout them out.
Gas pipeline.
Yep, houses, gas pipeline. Utility poles. What else? Road. Evergreens. You guys are good. Yes, you pretty much, thank you. Houses, the utility poles, the evergreens. It might not even be an evergreen, right? Those trees in that neighborhood, they just may be a neighborhood where if you set their trees on fire, they're not going to like you anymore. So just be really cognizant of what you're burning and where you're burning. So again, you want to prepare your burn plan. In here, you can see that we not only have a map of our units, we also have a description of the fuels that are currently there and what the adjacent lands look like. Is mostly flat with fuel consisting primarily of tall statue warm season grasses and forbs. That's what's out there. Areas of special concern. There we were within 300 feet of that road, which is a well-traveled road. So those are all things that you have to look at and think about. And then we also talk about the equipment needs down here. We talked about the backpack sprayers, drip torches, and flappers, having a cell phone on the property at the time of the burn for communication purposes. We've talked about the special concerns and hazards. We also include a map that talks about the firing sequence. You'll probably get various degrees of intricacies from the different biologists, but either way, they'll tell you the general what it's supposed to look like based on a certain wind direction. They may give you one example from one direction, and then you can extrapolate from there if the direction changes. And again, this burn plan will help the landowner thoughtfully prepare. That's the idea, because it's just really no fun. I mean, it's the idea of like fighting a really big fire sounds fun, but when you think about the end of the day, keeping you safe, keeping your property safe, and your neighbor's property safe, that's what the ultimate goal is, while hitting your management goals for conservation. I might just have you click if that works. Again, this is just reiterating what we just talked about, boundaries of the burn area for adjacent landowners. So we did talk, let's see if I have it in here. It may not be in here. So, but on your page, I put in highlight like the IDEM/open burning website. That's going to be your probably go-to to have all the information you need about prescribed burning for the state. And again, check your local ordinances. I think what's already existing on there for the Indiana code is more for rural burns, but again, we are in an urban area inside of Fort Wayne city limits, so these rules are not really applicable here today. But essentially, knowing that I had to get an IDEM permit, there's two forms for that. One form is, and I wrote this down because I knew I'd not get it right, there's a request for approval of the burn. So that's just saying, this is where I want to burn, and this is what I need to do. If you are going to try and get approval for more than just one calendar year, you actually have to include that map in the burn plan with it. Technically for their permit, and it says right on there, if it's only for 1 year, you don't need to do all that, but it's good to have no matter what. It also has you identify the location of rights of way, roads, and other potential structures. So maybe if you have like a shed or something out right there, those are things that you have to identify if they're within 300 feet. And then the other part we have is that you actually have to send identification of potentially affected persons. So that's where I personally like to use the county GIS website when I helped Eddie fill out the application, where I went there and just drew lines. So anyone within a 500-foot radius of the burn, and I even did some people on the periphery just to be safe. I included their name, contact name, and their address for those people to be notified. And when I sent it, or when Eddie sent the final form into IDEM, they actually updated it with a couple of addresses and added a few more people. So that's where this letter comes into play. So 2 weeks ago, I printed this out, signed it, and sent it to all those people on that list that IDEM sent back. Technically speaking, when you do this, if it's 15 people or less, IDEM will go ahead and mail them out anyway from air quality, saying what's going to happen. But as a good neighbor, it's really helpful that we do some type of letter of follow-up, so that way they can just contact you directly if they have a question. And then if it's more than 15 people, IDEM will actually run a local ad for the paper. It doesn't cost you anything for that portion. So these are all things to think about. If you are going to need an IDEM permit, they need it at least 60 days in advance. So that's why it seems a really long time, 6 months to a year to start planning for this stuff, but it's really not. By the time you get permit applications in, depending on where you are, site prepping, those types of things. And I said, like I said, we described all those things, and it's all in this burn plan that you guys have a copy of. And apparently I jumped the gun on my presentation, but again, this is what I took off from the potentially affected persons for this site. And you can see we have the historic Chief Richardville House, there's the bank, the fire department's even one of our people that we actually have to notify. So all these people had to be listed. And again, we talked about the site prep and equipment needs as well. So, and I think we've talked about all this as well, but preparing the burn plan, personnel needs, list all the personnel that will need to be, need to be safely and efficiently carry out the burn. I would always say it's safer to have more people than what you need. It's not fun, and I've been the person that just awkwardly holds a flapper at the back of the property while everyone else is burning, but at least I was there in the event that something did happen. Persons to be contacted, most of the time I said it's your local law enforcement, your local fire departments. I sent an email out to all those people required a week ago so that they knew it was coming. I called all of them yesterday. And I just kept on it to make sure people knew what we were doing if they had concerns. And when we say this, you have to be aware that, especially if you're working through permits through the city and IDEM, if someone comes and asks you to put it out, you have to put it out. It's not fun, it's a bummer, even if you have everything in place. If there's a local office of some sort, health, fire department, sheriff's department, if they come and say put it out, you got to be prepared to put it out. And it's a little counterintuitive, because obviously if smoke's the issue, as you're putting it out, you're probably going to put more smoke into the air. But it is really important that you just have everything prepared to, if you absolutely have to completely extinguish your fire. Pre-burn checklist, and this is also on this page, and it lists the range of conditions that must be met at the time the prescribed burn takes place. Again, for the time of year, February, it used to be April 15th, so that actually needs to be updating. But usually February to April, that's the window that we try to get some of the stuff done, and obviously in the fall for other things. You want to make sure you have the time of day so you can get the entire job done, including any follow-up work. So that includes mop up afterwards to make sure everything's actually extinguished. And it can be completed before sunset, because as I already mentioned, it's no fun to try and work on terrain in the dark while being worried about a fire. So you saw we were allowing between 40 and 60. The last time I checked, we were at 59% humidity, and we were at 61% when I first got here. So that would have been out. We're allowing wind speeds between 4 and 8 miles per hour. We are currently at 18 with gusts up to 25. And that is the biggest reason that we're probably going to have to say no today. Even without the wind, it's not likely we would have had a great ability with the humidity. But because of those safety features, we just can't do it today. And then you have your list of temperatures. And so this is your burn checklist. And it's really important to go through each one item by item. Actually, you can click that for me. We've talked about this. This talks about the soil moisture. I apologize, I jumped ahead of myself. So we talked about soil moisture. We even talked about allowable wind directions. I think most of the time we'll say all wind directions are allowable unless there's some really big extenuating circumstance, or maybe a sensitive area where you don't want smoke blowing towards. We'll talk about firing methods, which is going to be at the end of this, but I mentioned earlier that we will always only recommend back burning, and that's because the only thing we're allowed and qualified to tell you to do. If you want any other type of burning, that'll probably be on your own research and information looking into that. And for IDEM, there's always the contingency plan. What happens if your fire escapes? And that's always in there. What do you do? Who are you going to contact? Those types of things. And again, at any point, you can click again. If the answer is no on any of the questions, don't burn. It's like I said, again, it's not worth the risk if something goes horribly wrong. So now we're going to talk about some of the equipment and safety. And again, we will demonstrate all the equipment outside at the end of this, but if you want to go ahead forward. So when you're burning, it's really important that you have as natural materials on as you can. So things like cotton wool, leather, Nomex. These are all things that you should probably have on hand. Gloves are really important, not just for obviously what you're handling, but if you're using a drip torch for fuel, it's not really fun to always have the smell of kerosene and diesel on your hands. It's always a good idea to have some type of handkerchief or the necktie so you can put it up above your mouth if you're inhaling a lot of smoke or if you have a smoky fire. Depending on where you're burning, hard hats are a pretty good idea, especially if you have snags or dead trees that are upright on your property that may burn and fall. We don't need anybody getting concussions out there. If you have more frequent burns, or maybe you work for an agency in some capacity, or maybe you work for a property that has maybe multiple burning things, it may be worth the time to get something that's Nomex material. For the division, we obviously have material for us to wear, but if it's not available, it is okay. Just try and shoot for those natural materials that you wear. For boots, the minimum recommended height of your boot should be 8 inches. So these are all just things you want to make sure you have a good sole on there, so you're not stepping on anything hot. I've stepped on hot things with my feet. It's not fun. And no, it was not during a prescribed burn, but you get the idea. So these are all things to keep in mind. So this is the equipment that we actually have as district biologists to potentially lend out depending on the needs and what's available. On the far right, my far right, your far left, is a drip torch, which is usually a mixture of kerosene and diesel at different percentages. And like I said, we'll demonstrate that all out here, where you'll put that and basically it just drips out fire. And as you walk along, that's how you set your fire. We also have the backpack sprayers, which you fill with water, as it explains, put on your back, and then you have it there to put out the fire as needed. And then you have your flappers, which essentially you just use it to kind of rake and smother your fire at the end. And it's always important to at least have a flapper at the very end, just to kind of maybe walk around the edge and make sure nothing is still smoldering, because you don't want to leave something burning after you leave. Other equipment that we don't have available for renting out, but depending on where you're burning and how intense you need to get into burning, things like a chainsaw to cut up some smaller stuff ahead of time. They have the fire rakes and the McLoads to break up things and basically kind of turn up the earth to create a line, maybe if you needed to put it out. Shovels, those types of things, or combination tool, which is a shovel, all the other things in it. And then, as we mentioned before, if you have a big enough site, it may be important to have a backpack spray that you can take with you. We've been on burns where we demonstrated where essentially a spot fire happened and we basically had to send the water tank all the way down and put it out before. So it's depending on where you are, it's important to have what you need on site. For how to burn, this is where we'll talk a little bit more about the actual firing techniques that are not just back burning. So the first thing is that you want to do on your site, and we talked about making sure you have enough time to do this, is you really want to have your control lines or your fire breaks. The minimum fire break method should be at least 3 times the height of the vegetation or 15 feet, whichever is greater. So you want to make sure that's the good rule of thumb, to make sure you have ample space so you're not burning something down. You can have a couple different types of fire breaks. You can do exposed soil, so things like disking or rotivating your field. You can do burned fire breaks. Essentially, that's a previously burned section. And you'll see later that's the black section, and it's already burned, so it's more safe because it's not going to keep burning again. And you'll hear it called in the black or creating the black line. Those are something that you can do as well. You can also do green fire breaks. A lot of our management plans, we have done this where you do cool season grasses and clovers and some of the short stature mixtures on the periphery of your burn unit. And that way you just burn up to that line. Like we saw on the previous picture out here, they just have mown turf grass around. So they have that cool season grass as a fire break. Mowed fire breaks. There's also the wet line where people, depending on where you are, you can put water down and spray the lawn. Or if you're out west, you could probably put some more fire retardant down around the edge as well. You can also use things like the natural fire breaks. So lakes, rivers, ponds, roads. Roads aren't really natural, but it's an already existing delineation where you can burn up into that side. And keep in mind, obviously we're talking about prescribed fire that's going well and not raging. If you have a fire getting out of hand, and depending on where you are, please know that having water next to a burn site doesn't mean it can't potentially travel across that water body. It is a very real risk, and it's something that always needs to be mitigated for and watched for. Oh, okay. So this just kind of shows, so existing physical features, that one's along a road where you can see where that's kind of what is becoming the fire break. Tilling, Brian already talked a lot about tilling today, but tilling up the ground so you're just that soil where nothing's going to burn. They had a mowed strip, I think, closest to us, and then you also had tillage as well, so it kind of breaks up into different sections. A green fire crop, that's that mix of clover and some of the cold season grasses that we talked about. Another version of a green crop fire break, and then the black lines where usually, and like I said, we'll talk about this, where you're burning into the black so it's not going to burn again, and that can help stop your fire. So some terms of vocabulary that'll help you get through this a little bit. So essentially, we all probably know, but fire is not going to burn without oxygen, heat, and fuel. That's the burn triangle, essentially, the fire triangle of what you have to think about. You have to consider all those components for your burn. You have your average flame length, They had talked about the flaming zone and flame depth. We're really not going to get into that, but basically where you know how tall those flames are going to be, your wind direction, those are the most important things. If you look at this nomenclature, this is really helpful. So obviously the origin of your burn is where you start the fire. When the head of the fire is going with the wind away from your origin. If you're looking towards the direction of the fire, your left and right flank, those respectively. And then if you have areas in the middle that are unburned, those are usually called islands. And then as you can see at the very top right corner there, a spot fire is when your flame shoots out and goes out from what you've already started burning and creates kind of a gap in an uncontrolled way. Again, backing fire is what we're always going to recommend through the division because it's the easiest and safest method. Essentially, you start along a fire break toward the most downward edge of the area, and you basically allow the flame to burn into the wind. And then after that line gets completed, you step back and you do it again, and it keeps going back to the black. That makes sense. And then you can just kind of see how they're doing it here, where they just keep burning back towards that fire break. And this is just showing the wind is coming this direction, light the fire, and the fire is burning to that I guess green fire break there. A strip head fire, it basically is kind of the same idea as a backing fire, but you've just set a series of strips in order down that line, so then everything keeps burning at once. Essentially, you're timing it so that way no strip gets too big before it goes out again. Typically, you set those 20 to 50 feet apart. And this is just kind of showing you again, ideally, like I said, it's just a bigger version of a backing fire, but you're probably lighting a little more frequently and a little bigger strips. And you can see how they're doing it here. For smoke management, it's the responsibility of you who, as the fire starter, to minimize any effects that come from smoke. You need to try and stay up with the most up-to-date weather information. If you have high winds blowing smoke into a hospital, that's probably not a good idea. Burn on days when conditions allow the smoke to rise and dissipate, and not into roads or buildings or sensitive areas. We always recommend doing a small test fire just to see what happens right before you burn. Burning in the middle of the day is helpful. And when you have really large units, breaking those into smaller units is helpful. And again, if you have a really large area, you're looking to maybe burning 50 to 60% at a time. You don't want to burn on organic soil. So if you have I have a peat bog out back for any reason, which would be kind of cool at some level. Don't burn those, because essentially what happens is that vegetation on the ground just consistently keeps burning. That can lead to wildfires and can be extremely difficult to put out. And then, as I already mentioned, be prepared to extinguish for any and all reasons, including law enforcement, health department, fire department, any of those things. After the burn is completed, you really need to make sure you're inspecting the area. You need to ask yourself, was my fire break effective? If I go again, do I need to maybe adjust my fire breaks? Did I have what I needed to have to safely burn as far as personnel and equipment? Did I get the result that I was expecting? Maybe any other things that you would do differently? And then depending on the severity and heat of the burn, keep returning, make sure it's extinguished. Another thing that I do want to highlight, you notice here in the middle where there's still tall stands of grasses, it should never be your goal as doing prescribed fire just to scorch the earth and every little thing needs to be lit on fire. It's okay to have some vegetation popped up. We call that like a mosaic look. We talked about burning smaller sections to allow refugia for wildlife and things, but those areas within the burn patch can serve as areas for pollinators. Depending on how large it is, maybe a bird or two can get in there, those types of things. So whenever you're doing a burn, you really don't want to try and scorch every little square area of your section. That's not the point of a burn. The point is to do controlling, and if you have something like that, you've done your job. So far as resources go, again, wildlife.in.gov, you have your biologist, your burn plan. You can find one of our biologists you can talk to about a burn plan, borrowing equipment. If you're in the Fort Wayne area, I have potential funding for landowners for the right project. We also have a lot of habitat fact sheets. Our website has finally been updated a little bit. So we have habitat types, species preference for maybe quail, if that's what you're looking for, maybe wild turkey, prescribed fire fact sheet as well, which you all have a copy of that as well. This thing right here. So if you need to make another copy or send it out, we have this available as well. And then, as I already mentioned and wrote on your page, idem.in.gov/open burning, that's going to give you the links to all the rules and regulations that you need for the state. And after that, I guess you have any questions, and thank you again for listening. Made that.
The boots,
Mhm.
you said like 8 inches tall.
Mhm.
Do they like rubber boots or-
What would you usually recommend, Ryan? Is there a certain brand or type you recommend for boots?
If you're carrying a drip force on one day, the arm might get tired. If you've got rubber boots, you have possibly drip fuel on your boots and then no.
And that goes back to just those natural materials. If you think about, you know, I've got a rubber wash on there. If I'm working the hot enough fire or something, I probably won't want to be wearing that out there, because think about what could melt and stick to your skin, and that's not going to be pleasant for anybody.
The jeans will catch on fire. Synthetic fabric will not.
Yeah, same as we talked about leather gloves. So I wouldn't recommend rubber gloves or anything like that. You just want to make sure, just think about what would potentially melt to your skin, which is not a pleasant thing to think about, but that's what you kind of have to think about to make sure you're avoiding those types of things that may cause a potential health concern.
I know that today's talk has mainly been about grassland and prairie prescribed burning. Obviously, woodland prescribed burning is another option that's around the area. Do we go through the similar avenues of entities to get those conducted, or are there different regulations for what they're doing down in southern Indiana?
Right.
Obviously,
I actually don't have any experience with forest burning, so I was going to ask Ryan or Kent if they had any information that they could share on that.
right.
Yeah, you just have more complex. So you got potential for snakes. If you're burning grass, smoke will be done. A lot. A lot more important.
I guess now that I think about it, I did help with the Roush burn in a wooded area, and essentially the lighting of it was pretty much the same, but I know that we started, I think, at like 11 in the morning, and I know that they were there, well, even after the fire, we left the fire, I think at like 4 o'clock, but I know they were there at least until 8 p.m., making sure that all the smoldering stuff stayed out. Yeah.
Right. I know some guys camp out, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, my question was just if I were interested in finding information on.
Yeah, I would,
regulations on that.
for the, like he said, the rules and regulations would be the same. I would just make sure you can deal with the complexities of it. So good question though.
So we're all.
Not necessarily. I know for, is it CRP guys that the deadline's April 1st?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're past it for certain funded habitats. I would probably still not recommend much into April. I would probably say this was pushing based on the availability time and permit wise. But I would say, I think the general rule of thumb that's not outside of CRP would probably be April 15th, but I would probably argue April 1st would be a much better deadline.
So those are, we're gonna have to, mow or something.
For
This property.
probably mowing or maybe a fall burn instead, because this plan and this permit for the SWCC is good for a year. It just has to make sure you're falling within those parameters. And if you want more wildflowers, it's probably better for your wildflower development anyway. So.
Bernie, so my ideal plan down there for the
I think I don't know if it has an expiration date. I know it's good for a year. I'd have to go back and look specifically. It'll expire March 10th, 2022. So if you can get it burned before March 10th.
Later burns is a good thing. The opposite is true in August, September. Positive benefit to the forest and negative benefit to the grasses. So over the last, I suppose, 10 years now, really kind of shifted our focus from burning in this way.
Any other questions about the urban program, about Ryan, about district biologists, about burning? All right, as I mentioned, unfortunately, our wind conditions as of right at the end of Ryan's speech are outside of favorable conditions for safety of burning. So if you guys want, take a quick minute, use the restroom, grab a snack, and we will probably meet you all down by the prairie area to look at the habitat, and then we'll demonstrate our equipment. And then after that, if you guys are wanting to, we have a couple of video clips to play on here of actual burns, and Kent, Ryan, and I would be up here and answering questions as it's burning if you guys have them. So let's plan on being down there about it's 1:55 now, so if we can be down there about 2:10, if that works, give everybody time. Perfect.
Shirt, green pants. For some reason, people kind of recognize that as you know what you're doing, and they don't call.
I'm not worried about turning fire, but because, and it might be something to think about too, there's fuel in there, right? So you really don't want to get it on your clothes. So that's why I personally brought the gloves out. I guess, do you want to talk about what you're using first?
Sure. Are we still on camera?
Yes, we're not on Zoom, but we're on videoing it.
Okay. So today, again, we're not going to be burning because of the weather conditions we have. One of those is the high winds we're getting. What I've got here is a personal weather station. It's called a Kestrel. This is an electronic device. You can also get kind of more manual devices called a belt weather kit. This is going to take several different weather parameters, everything from relative humidity, temperature, wind speed. Those are kind of the primary ones I'm using when I'm looking at it. If you'll notice here, if you can see it, there's a little fan or a little blade in there that'll spin. So essentially you're just going to face whichever direction the wind is coming and kind of just leave it there for a while. It will give you the exact wind speed at the time that it's blowing, but then it also gives you the average speed that you've had while you've been sitting here. So while I've been sitting here, we're at a max of 5.9. And we're somewhere, it looks like, you know, anywhere from 4 kind of on average, but one of the important factors a lot of times is your relative humidity. So I think your plan goes up to 60?
60 for this one.
So when we first got here today, we were right around kind of the 70% relative humidity. Right now we're a little lower, so we're in the 53 range. So we're starting to get kind of some, you know, within range of some of these parameters, but to me, one of the bigger things we have to worry about here is the amount of cloud cover. So anytime you've got kind of a layer of clouds like this, it's an indicator that your atmosphere is pretty stable. In order to have really good smoke rise and smoke dispersal, you want an unstable atmosphere. So you kind of want patchy clouds where you've got this thick kind of lower layer of clouds. It's likely that smoke is going to rise a little bit, but not disperse very well. So you can start getting some issues with neighboring folks, or you know, traffic hazards, things like that. So you really do want to pay attention to not only, you know, what the fire is going to do, but what your smoke is going to do too. And that's kind of a factor a lot of times people don't think about. But that's what I got on weather.
So I guess we'll do the easier stuff to demonstrate first. This is the flapper that I showed you. Flapper because it looks essentially just like a mud flap flapping on a truck somewhere. But what you're gonna do if you had a fire burning, you're gonna take it and just kind of, if you have stuff burning and leaves, cover it, smother it, kind of work along your way as you need it to. Anything else you guys wanted to add about the flapper? This is a pretty basic tool. We call it mop up at the end. That's what you're doing because it looks a little bit that way.
They call it a flapper, but really, I think you should think of it more as a mop. And you almost, so typically what you'd have going on, or why you'd be using it, we'd be burning this intentionally. We'd have creep going out into our break. A lot of times with grass fire breaks, as you stand here, you see a lot of this little brown stuff in here. It will actually creep out into that, and so you'd essentially be using this as a mop. You'd have a little bit of fire, and you just put it on it and push it into the ground. The more aggressively it's burning, the harder I push it into the ground, basically. And if you have a bigger fire that you're trying to put out and it's really hot, oftentimes it's handy to either have one of the water jugs on your back so that you can continually cool that mat down. My property, we've got half a dozen of these that have been overheated, and they're all curled up, and they're basically useless at this point. They need new mat flaps on them. The other thing, it's kind of a joke I tell every time I talk about these things. The real proper way to use these is like this, just leaning on them, watching the fire burn within your fire breaks. If you've done everything right up to lighting the fire, this is how you use a flapper. It's a tripod. You're just leaning on it, watching it burn, staying out of the smoke.
And I mentioned in there it's not fun to be the person. That's usually what my job has been, especially being newer to prescribed fire. I had the flapper, I watched everything to make sure nothing went wrong, and nothing went wrong, which is good.
Where can you get those? Like 3 places are the most common ones. So Ben Meadows, they're online places. They've actually been absorbed by Forestry Suppliers. Okay, so Forestry Suppliers is the only one left. And then what's the other one? There was a third one, Ben Meadows, Forestry Suppliers, and then there was another. And then big specialty houses that do fire gear for structural departments, they'll sell this stuff too. But mostly it was always done by forestry type companies. I bought one of those myself, and I just bought it on Amazon. One of those cans, they're available on Amazon. never looked for these, but I'll bet you $1 they're there.
Just almost like a sprayer used for orchard
So they're a
yeah.
little different. They're a little different. Yeah, go ahead. You talk
Listen,
about that.
listen,
And
I-
then
did you
this
want- I
is
guess
this is
it-
another. This
I
is
thought you
something
did the
that
right
I
first and
always
then
bring
the
a rake and a metal rake, just a leaf rake, because
That's
when
a
it's
fire
creeping,
flower.
you can move so much fire and burnable debris very fast with this. I don't like burning when I need a rake, but when I need a rake, it's awful nice piece of equipment to have available when you need it, though.
One quick point on the flappers, you can purchase those for about 50 bucks a piece typically.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe.
They sell all the fire equipment.
Okay, no, it's
A
possible.
lot of stuff like that.
Who's that?
They might.
No X supply.
Yeah, that's what I think is one of the more structural fire department specialty house. They sell all kinds of stuff for regular structural fire departments. Like I say, a lot of times they'll have these. Sometimes I would be a little careful. Those places, they like to mark stuff up. So
I'm sure they will.
if you look around, you might find them at other places for quite a bit less. Go ahead.
Alright, so there's different types of water tanks. That one's a hard case. This is more flexible. They're all pretty much similar in structure. You'll have this proper backpack. You'll want to tighten it up so you're actually carrying it up on your back, not low down. Some of these you can adjust which side, if you're right-handed, left-handed, but you have a little hook to hang it up out of the way as you need to. And then as you need to, if I won't spray you this time.
Yeah.
And if you need to, you just, right now, this one comes with two tips where you see that more wide stream. The one on that one is adjusted for the flat stream right now, and that just is a quick, it unscrews, and you can switch it over. And then that way you can probably get more. When I've done them, I like this one a little better because it's a little more spot specific, so that way it creeps out and you need to.
And it shoots farther, so you don't
Shoots
have to
further.
be as close to the hot fire.
Yeah. So that's one way to do it. When you're storing these, don't recommend storing them with water in it. Turn them upside down, drain them out, let them dry out. Try and clean out the tubes. We were actually just having a conversation. I actually kind of like this one because it conforms a little better to my back, but whereas you can't seem to prefer those, so personal preference. Same general concept there, just a harder tank, and I don't think they're rated for any chemical storage, correct? They're all just
Diesel apparently.
well, yeah, unless incorrectly used, but they're not really designed for chemical storage.
No.
They're designed for water storage.
Yeah. A lot of people that don't have something like this, the backpack herbicide sprayers can be handy. The only kind of downside to them is they can't put the volume of water out as quick. It's a smaller stream and less volume, and you can't shoot it near as far. When you switch that, yeah, that thing will throw water 15, 20 feet. Whereas the little wand sprayers with the pressurized tanks, they're okay. They're better than nothing, I guess. But
That's what I use at my house, is just a little 4-gallon backpack herbicide sprayer. But these are definitely nicer. So one, it doesn't have a clip, so it doesn't hold that up out of the way. You can't use another tool very easily a lot of times without that dragging along behind you. And yeah, it doesn't put out the volume. So one time we were doing a small kind of woodland burn, and we had a small escape, and then I had an old stump that was catching fire. The volume of water that those pump out is way better than what I would have gotten out of the little herbicide backpack sprayer though.
And we didn't really get into this, but I showed you some of the other tools like the McLoads and the shovels, because you can use the shovel to hack something. You could scrape up dirt and put it out in the fire if you needed to. So if you have more complex burns, probably not necessarily always in Indiana, but if you went out west maybe and did a little more intense burns, those would be other materials that you would think about using. And then we also didn't talk about this today. There is a way, if you get trained to be Red Card certified, meaning that you can be called upon to help with wildfires. And you know, most of us here could probably carry these backpacks, but there's a reason that they make you carry a 40-pound weight on you and you walk when you do them. So you have to be able to carry your equipment when you're doing the fire too. So I think everyone here would be okay, but if you think about it, if you know someone burning, just make sure you're assessing, you know, if you have younger kids out there or maybe older adults, just make sure that the people can physically carry the stuff to put out the fire as well. It's really important just to make sure everyone's as safe as possible.
Are the materials that those sprayers are made out of more fire resistant than what you get on, you know, are they any better? Is that matter?
The old cans, so this poly can is really just evolved from an old stainless steel can. That was the standard that was used forever. When I'm the oldest one of the three of us. When I started, we were all using stainless steel cans. And then the next thing that happened was they made this slightly different than that, but it's a poly bag, and those were the berries. Everybody loved those for a while, but they don't hold up as long. And then that style came out with that Cordura bag, and then there's an inner bag inside there that's a cheap replaceable bag. And those are very comfortable. I just like this because it conforms to your back, and you don't have to worry about breaking it or cracking it or whatever. That's just my preference, but those are pretty darn nice too. The big thing is the cheap ones come with just garbage backpack straps on them. The better ones come with the nicer pack straps like that one has. That makes it a lot better. The other thing is, so we have all of our district positions, we have a couple sets of this burn gear that we loan out to people. So if you get a burn plan from us and know you're going to be burning, we have it available to loan out. But I always tell people, if you want to do that, get in touch with me and plan on burning on a day or a weekend or whatever, and you can have it for a short period of time, but there's a relatively, you know, good demand for it, so we try to get it out and get it back.
Well. I actually drove 2 weeks ago to go pick this up from Elkhart before I came out and got ready for today. And the last thing we're left with is the drip torch. There's other things that we don't have on today, like a fusee, where you essentially light. It's almost like a Roman candle, but not quite.
Yeah, I've never used those.
I've only seen them demonstrated. I've not actually physically used them myself. Where you can just kind of walk.
They're like road flares.
Yeah, exactly.
They're essentially road flares. So they got a striker cap, and you just carry them around, and they're not nearly as efficient as these. I wish we could demonstrate these, because once you see these used and you actually burn with them, you'll never go back to anything else again, because they're easy to carry and they make fire like you can't believe.
So this is what it'll look like in storage mode. Inside, there's a mixture of diesel and kerosene. I think that's what we like to recommend. People definitely adjust their fuel for what they need to do.
It's supposed to be 4 parts diesel, 1 part gasoline. Well,
kerosene.
That's the old way they used to do it. Now they recommend 1 part diesel, 1 part gas, 1 part kerosene.
So
I cannot get it to burn to save my life.
So
that's why I said 4 to 1.
There's a little cap over here. It covers what will be seen when we take out, and then you just screw it in beside it, and that just keeps it.
Here, use a dry one. That one's got fuel in it, and this one's dry.
This one, so I'll do this, and then I'll show you actually the rest of it on this one. So you'll unscrew it here, and then you'll just screw this cap in. Just keeps it nice and out of the way. You have this lock ring right up here. You pull that out and take it off, and then you'll actually pull up the whole wick. Looks like that. Okay, up right there, and then you'll put the lock ring back over it.
Turn the pigtail straight away from the handle. There you go.
That's a good point. And
supposedly that's important for the safety issue. I've never seen any of them ever have fire come back in, but they say that's important for that to be straight away from the handle.
And then there's a valve here that you can allow for the airflow in order for the fuel to get down to your wick, and then you can light it, and then as you go, as you drip, it'll drip lit fuel, and that's how you burn.
I'll show you. So this basically breaks the vacuum, is what that little valve does. And what you want it to do is the fuel to run through this, you know, this little pigtail thing come out, and there's actually a little nozzle right here. You don't want it shooting across, you want it dripping slowly into this wick area. It's a piece of fiberglass enclosed in the case. and you want it saturated with the fuel, and it basically dripping in there, and then dripping out the bottom of the wick, so that you're just laying little spots of fire as you walk along, and just drip, 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 and you end up laying a line of fire.
You can also take it too, if you need more fire, you can actually take it and throw fire,
Yeah.
create these little chevrons, so it'll pitch fire out into the stand and then make a wider fire line if you need that fire line faster. Are you guys going to demonstrate actually lighting it a
I
little
was
bit?
going to, just so they can see. We won't light anything on fire, but just the dripping. And honestly, Kat, I've always been handed lit drip torches, so I would love anybody's guidance because I've always been handed them lit.
So to light
go back to the
light the drip torch, you don't actually light the drip torch.
Yeah, just put a little bit on the ground
Yep, that's what I thought. But
and then light that pad.
So
actually, I
use
should.
it-
Is this okay if we do that here?
use this little spot here with the torch. This torch grass. Just put, saturate a little spot of that.
Chase that hole off.
Yeah.
Cook them all just in case.
Yeah.
See how it came out that way?
That's too much, right?
Yeah.
Shooting out.
Yep. So I'm backing off the thing.
And they act a lot of times they act a little crazy when you first start turning them over, and then they get a little more consistent.
Right.
Yeah. So here, what I do is I just do like put a little bit on the ground. I'll take that. And then there you go. And then you
Yep.
dip that in. That's still way too open.
Yeah. I was trying to get it down.
That's stiff. And then you're just, yeah, see, I can't get this
Okay.
one turned down enough.
Yeah.
But anyway, it should be doing more like that right there.
Just little drips as you go.
Yeah. And then to blow it out, cup your hand around it, give it a blow, and it goes right out.
And then we're looking for the flapper.
I don't think we'd have had much success over there as quick as that went out.
And then you all saw I refrained from it earlier, but now
Now game's on, right? So that's the equipment.
and then when you go to put that away, you'll let it cool down fully and completely, and then you'll do the reverse of what we did to get it out and open. Any questions about the equipment? I think with that, those who want to, we were going to talk about what we see on site here, and then I guess we'll leave it up to you guys if you want to come and watch more about actual videos of fire and go from there. So I guess my first thought, because I noticed a lot of things when I first pulled in today, if you guys are looking at this prairie and you're going to burn today, what are some things that you see that you need to be cognizant of?
Fence.
The fence? What else?
Used to be signs.
Used to be signs?
People in that trailer.
Thank you. That's the one I was looking for. Because when I pulled in, I saw a bunch of little kiddos, a couple dogs, and a family trying to burn or trying to have a good time. So I actually had a conversation with them before this workshop started about what we would or would not do depending on if we lit a fire. Again, it's really important to maintain safety at all times. Is there anything else that you guys do notice? You probably will notice it on that side if we start walking.
Better at camp or a little too close, really.
Yes, I would. Especially because there's at least 4 little kids in there. And I don't know what it would or would not do, but when I talked to him, I said it would be up to you because it's your own personal equipment. I said you could choose to put everything in and shut it up so it's not to get smoke in there, but he said he was also worried about discoloration from smoking and orphans. So that was his call, it's his property. But my biggest concern was for the safety of his family. So yes, had we burned today, we were actually going to work with him to move his whole unit away from this site. Do you guys see anything in the distance over there that might have been a concern? The tops of the white boxes maybe? Yes, bees. They have beehives here. So that's something that I talked with Eddie about prior to this, make sure they were all okay and knew what was happening ahead of time.
But what we're doing is we'll put big plastic bags over them or physically move it.
We might not have moved them. We might
No.
just not have burned that area closest to them. We
No.
might have had to make a burn line, stopping a bigger distance from those beehives, and then burn the other area.
They plug the bee holes. They'll come out at night and then plug that. No plastic things over or nothing. They plug that hole and the bees are stuck in there until we get done.
Well, and
They
even
will-
if it's not just about the bees, it's about the box itself, right? Because those can add up after a while. So that was something we had to think about. I don't know if you can see it from here, but there was also a new little tree on the edge over here. And I did talk to Eddie because they definitely didn't want that one burnt. So those were all things that we walked around and saw.
What pine tree? Is that
I did
the
hear
pine trees
Pine
over
trees.
there?
pine
Is
trees.
that a problem maybe?
I don't think it would have been an issue because if we would have burned today, the wind is south to southeast. It would push that way, but we would have been starting right there at those. And so at that point, your fire is actually pretty small and pretty manageable. You don't have a big, in the presentations, they were talking about 15-foot flame lengths or 3 times the size of the fuel. When you light on the downwind side at the edge of the fuel, typically your flame lengths are maybe waist high normally, and you're creeping against the wind, so it's much slower and lower and not nearly as aggressive and big and scary fire. So that's a big part of the reason why we typically, when we write these plans for private individuals that don't burn all the time, it's exclusively backing fires or fires against the wind. Because if we were to, like on a day like today, if we were going to burn and we did the way I see a lot of inexperienced agricultural landscape burners burn, they'd walk up here to the head of this thing and drop fire and watch it go roaring across there. And they would effectively burn it, and it would be fast, but there would be a whole bunch of puckering going on as it went across there, and you wonder, is it going to stop when it hits that backside? Whereas if you do it the way we want you to do it, you start on the downwind side, you've got a small manageable fire, it works its way back, and you get much less smoke. You'll ultimately probably get the same amount of smoke, but it moves so much slower, you get a much more thinner, consistent stream of smoke than if we lit it at the head and let it run through. Every bit of that volatile carbon products would all go up within about a 5-minute period, and you'd see this huge plume of smoke that you'd see all the way across town.
And that's when the phone calls will start, and that's why you call your fire department and your sheriff's department ahead of time, because if anyone sees smoke, especially in an urban area, that's a problem, or typically they think of it and associate it as a problem. So that's why you call them ahead of time, because it's not fun to waste their time and resources either sending a fire department out for a fire that's prescribed and burned correctly.
You're using essentially the principle that the firefighters use the backfire for a major forest fire.
Right. Yeah. That's
Same principle.
right. If they are fighting an out of control wildfire, a lot of times it's quite a bit different game. They'll be in there with big heavy equipment, and they'll till in a fire break essentially, and then they'll start lighting on that fire break and working it back towards the out of control fire. So they're creating a big black area with no fuel in it, so they reduce the risk of spot fires continually just walking away and walking on down.
It doesn't keep spreading.
Yeah.
One other thing I guess to consider here today, especially with the winds we've got, if you'll notice that as we've been standing here, you're getting wind on one side and then in the next minute it's coming on the other. That can make for real tricky lighting, especially if you're new to it. And I don't know if that's the weather we're getting or because we're kind of sheltered here and we got this woods, but anytime you're against the woods, you might get these weird kind of swirls.
Know
So
your terrain.
just be aware that, like Kent was saying, you can start backing with a nice 3-foot flame length, but if that wind shifts on you, now you've got 15 foot going the other way. So
And I have, when I did my wildland fire training, we did have an acre in an open field with nothing around, and all of a sudden this wind came and it was like the fire just poof, and it got a little nerve-wracking, especially for a bunch of people learning how to do it. And that's why for that property we had an ATV that had the water. I mean, it's not fun when the fire goes wrong. It's just not.
I've had a fire get away from me one time, and it's not fun at all. It's not fun at all. When you got to call the fire department and you didn't plan on it, you don't want to do that. And that was simply a case of we were burning, things were going so well, and early in the day the conditions were perfect, but as it got later in the day, there was a front coming through in the afternoon, and we just kind of neglected to realize that it was going to change, and so we're having good luck burning against the wind, and then all of a sudden the wind in a matter of about 10 minutes flipped clear around, and it's going the opposite way where we didn't have a good solid break, and then you can't stop it with this type of equipment. It takes more water. On our fish and wildlife areas, we do a lot of burning, and we try to do it much faster than private landowners can, because there's a lot of acres that need to be burned. But we have typically on a fish and wildlife area, we'll have 2 or 3 trucks and maybe an ATV unit that'll carry 200 to 300 gallons of water each one. So we could get away with some things that we don't ever recommend private landowners trying to do, just because we have so much more water available.
And when we did, speaking of that, when I did the one on Roush, we were basically in a ring and we were trying to burn towards the center. And that ATV continuously kept going around in circles, making sure we had our water ready to go, making sure that no fires were out of control. We did that section in the woods. No creep. And then, so we did that section in the woods. We also did the prairie where we had a truck where we actually had to spray water from distance because we did have a spot fire that got away from us, and we had to go and put that out.
So yeah, it's the biggest thing that I could say on these smaller private burns is site preparation ahead of time. Ideally, I mean, this is a good fire break, but an ideal fire break is something that if you have a tractor mounted rototiller or a good disc, you make 8 to 15 feet of tilled dirt, basically unburnable material. That's the ideal, that's the perfect situation.
And that's going back to, like, you don't want to burn those organic soils. So the soil out here, it's likely not to have anything in to burn, but if you have something like peat on there or something like that, that burn's just going to keep going. Even if you don't see it on the surface, it can potentially go below surface and cause extraordinary, it'll burn for a long time, and it's not fun.
Might get a show of hands who's going back in.
I guess, is there anything else that you guys had out here? Any other questions? Or anybody want to walk the site or anything like that?
Take off and they get the
How can you tell that this is like ideal to burn now? The species that's available?
So to me, it's just kind of, do you have enough fuel out there to carry a fire effectively?
Okay.
So sometimes with earlier plantings, you know, if this were 2 years ago, you just might not have had enough grasses out there or large enough grass clumps to carry that fire effectively through there. So if you did burn, it'd be much patchier. We're starting to get, you know, enough connectivity between those patches and those clumps, and those clumps are large enough that they'll easily carry a fire through there. That's, I guess, to me, what I look at is how much fuel do you have and will it carry, I guess. But
Can you base it on like I'm not seeing as many flowers? Is it time to burn?
I think for assessment for if you need to burn.
oh, so like when do you need to burn? Sort of question.
I didn't write in like 5 years ago. There seemed like there's more flowers. Would that be a good time to burn it, or
Yeah, to me, I mean, it's
balance like a very
yeah, I tend to just like to get it on a rotation and try to just keep it burned every 3 to 5 years, just because that's going to help keep woody encroachment out, and that's, to me, one of the bigger things.
And
If you're not seeing the wildflowers like you used to, then that would be kind of a management decision on timing of burn, not necessarily do I need to burn.
And you'll see, to kind of go back to the passionate that Ryan was talking about, so this was the original section that was planted, and it has a little bit better conductivity, but they actually extended the triangle on the other side, and that is actually just coming up in really big separate clumps. And so I had talked to Eddie about that section probably wouldn't carry a fire very well. So if anyone wanted to see that, you could go see it.
But yeah, to me, when I just looked out in there, you can see there's still quite a bit of wildflowers. So all these little seed heads at the edge, there's some other seed heads out in there. To me, this looks like it's still a pretty good, you know, diverse mix. You're not getting overly dominated by grasses here. And there, you know, I think a spring burn or a fall burn, dormant season burn, anything would really be pretty applicable here. What you don't want to do is just get into that same routine where you're burning, you know, every other year in the springtime. That's going to really start setting your forbs back. And if you come up here and look at some of them, you can kind of see those little leaflets that we were talking about, the little leaves. Yeah. Well, if you look at this bee balm or monarda here, you can see all these little tiny guys that, you know, some of those have probably been sitting there all winter, but they're really starting to put on growth now. Because they're a perennial plant, that energy is coming up out of the root system, right, to put this on until it can get enough leaf area to start pulling energy back to the roots. So if you burned it off, you're going to be burning off all of the growth that it's been trying to get up. The warm season grasses, all of the big clumps we have here, have yet to start graining up and growing. So you're going to burn off this old dead material. You'd also burn off the dead material of the bee balm, but you're going to catch these guys. So the grasses, while they haven't started growing yet, are then going to be free and clear to just burst forth, and these guys have to start back over as well. You see what I'm saying? So constantly burning in the spring is going to tend to set back the grasses, or tend to set back the wildflowers and promote the grasses. And that's where, you know, altering that timing can be beneficial to keep it in a diverse stand out here.
And I think that's a common misconception with a lot of people that just kind of go out and burn. They think that, oh, I have to burn it every year, it's that time. And I think the important thing to take away here is that you want to actually plan for it and think about what you're trying to burn and why you're burning, and not just burning because it's the time of year that you're supposed to burn. And you're also, you can even kind of see it's not scorched earth as we talk about. You see there's an open spot here where over here would probably be more contiguous, and that's okay to have out on the landscape. And it's good because it's a diverse landscape, which means diverse wildlife. And if you're asking one of us, the more diversity, the better. So that's all important things to keep in mind.
So if we were burning that with that picture example there where the green is, we would burn around it as much as we could.
It just would on its
It
own.
just would on its own. That's what I'm saying.
It just go around it.
I've been on burns where the person kept trying to burn and it was clearly not burning. They just kept lighting it and kept lighting it and kept lighting it. And I said, it's not going to burn, so just let it go through. And unless it's a really big obvious sign that for some reason the fire missed, you don't have to kill yourself trying to keep making something that doesn't want to burn. It's okay if you have clumps that aren't.
So I just grabbed, looks like maybe four different forbs in a, you saw where I was walking around, 20 yard circle here or something, that are in this stand. So it's a relatively diverse stand, and it's still pretty open. You see, they were talking earlier about the clumpy nature of these native grasses. So here's a clump, that's one plant, and then there's space in between, another clump, another clump, another clump. That's kind of what we really want to promote, because if you think about a small precocial grassland bird like a turkey or a bobwhite or a pheasant, they're on the ground and they have to be able to move around, and they feed themselves. They're not like, you know, songbirds in a nest where mom and dad go out and grab food, bring it back to them. They're within hours of hatching, they're out and running around and looking for bugs on their own. So they have to be able to move through this. And if you think about a quail in particular, they're about as big as my thumb. They're like the size of a bumblebee. They have to be able to get through this stuff. And if it gets overly thick, they can't do it. So that's why we're working on trying to keep these grass stands thinner. And the idea behind that late growing season burn, you catch the grass with a whole bunch of investment above the ground. And this clump here, it's maybe a foot to a foot and a half in diameter right now. If we catch that all green and burn it green, that foot and a half clump maybe shrinks back down to 3 or 4 inches for the next year or two, and then it continues to grow back up. Grasses, over time, grasses just tend to get bigger and stronger and more robust, and we're trying to basically beat them down and keep them from getting to be the big dominant plants in these stands. And the forbs, they tend to a lot of times come back from seed pretty regularly. Some of them are long-lived, robust, stout perennials, but many of them are short-lived compared to the grasses. So we're always trying to basically set it back, set it back, set it back so the forbs stay in there. And then talking about all the other benefits of forbs, the insects, the seed production, all those kinds of things. So before we get soaking wet, the 4 that I found here, just like I said, walking around real quick. Purple coneflower, you see this in landscaping a lot. It's one of the really commonly used pretty native wildflowers in landscaping. This is gray-headed or yellow coneflower. There's a fair amount of it mixed in here. It's not as easy to see in the stand as the bergamot, which is this one. You see a lot of these with these little funny looking round heads. They're all over in this area. This is a grassland mint that's really common, has a real nice smell, and that's a great pollinator plant. This is remnants of New England aster. There's actually, there's a little bit of the bloom remnants, but this is one of the latest blooming plants that you're going to see out in these prairies. It's blooming in September and into October. Purple blooms, really beautiful plant. Provides a lot of benefit for late season pollinator, particularly honeybees and things like that, to accumulate nutrients before they basically go to bed for the winter. And then this is stiff goldenrod. It's a remnant of a stiff goldenrod.
And
I'll leave
if
goldenrod
you're looking
alone.
for pollinator, that's that good rule of thumb. You want at least 3 colors blooming per season to attract pollinators. And I'm going to put in the unpopular plug here that honeybees are all good and whatever, but they're not a native bee. So when you're managing for pollinators, we're talking about our native bees, our native flies, our native ants. Like I said, honeybees aren't bad, they have their place. But if we're really talking about really creating a diverse mix for pollinators, you really want your native pollinators, your diverse mix of native plants. And as we talked about how important it is, think about what those little birds are eating, and the birds are eating in this field. They're eating those insects. It's the base of our food chain. That's why it's so important. And I think Ryan hit on this, but 1 in every 3 bites of food you take is either directly or indirectly because of a native pollinator. So if you really think about the importance of pollinators and how important it is for their conservation, that is why this pollinators, habitats, the grasslands, the native forbs, they're all really important.